Part 1. The Cabin Beneath the Silent Pines. Winter settled gently over the northern forest, wrapping every pine tree in a soft white blanket. Snow drifted through the quiet air like tiny feathers, and the only sound was the slow whisper of the wind moving through ancient branches. Hidden deep among those towering pines stood a small wooden cabin that almost disappeared beneath the snow each winter. The cabin belonged to a man named Elias Mercer. Many years ago, Elias had lived in a lively town filled with warm cafes, busy streets, and cheerful conversations. He had been a skilled carpenter, known for crafting beautiful rocking chairs, tiny wooden toys, and sturdy tables that often remained in families for generations. His hands were strong, but his heart was even gentler. Life, however, had slowly changed. One winter, illness quietly carried away his beloved wife. Clara, their only daughter, had already moved across the country to begin her own life. And after a series of unanswered letters, silence became the only message that remained between them. The busy town that once felt comforting suddenly became unbearably loud. Every familiar street reminded Elias of someone he had lost. Every corner carried memories too heavy to hold. So he left. He traveled north until he found a forgotten cabin resting beside a frozen creek. The roof needed repair, the windows rattled in the wind, and the chimney leaned slightly to one side. Yet when he stepped inside, something about the quiet welcomed him. It asked nothing of him except to breathe. That was enough. For 7 winters, Elias lived there alone. Each morning, before the sun climbed over the snowy hills, he lit the stone fireplace. The gentle crackle of burning pine filled the room with warmth, while the scent of cedar drifted through the cabin. He brewed a simple cup of tea, watched tiny snowflakes gather on the windows, and greeted the silent forest as though it were an old friend. The animals slowly accepted his presence. A curious red fox often crossed the frozen creek at sunrise. Chickadees landed outside his window every afternoon, waiting patiently for the handful of seeds he scattered across the porch. Even a shy white rabbit sometimes rested beneath the old pine tree near the cabin, perfectly still, as if listening to the forest breathe. Elias spoke softly to them, not because he expected answers, but because kindness never truly disappears when it is shared. Leather journal resting on his lap. Instead of writing about sadness, he described the shape of falling snow, the glowing moon above the trees, and the peaceful silence that wrapped around the cabin after sunset. He believed every quiet day deserved to be remembered. Yet beneath that peaceful routine, one small hope still lived inside his heart. Every evening, before blowing out the lantern, Elias walked to the old wooden mailbox standing beside the narrow forest path. It was almost always empty. Still, he opened it with the same gentle care, smiled to himself, and whispered, "Maybe tomorrow." Then he returned to the warm cabin, never realizing that somewhere beyond the endless forest, a single letter had finally begun a journey through the snow, one that would soon change the quiet rhythm of his lonely life forever. Part 2. The Letter Through the Snow. The next morning arrived with a pale, golden sunrise stretching gently across the frozen forest. Snow sparkled like tiny diamonds beneath the light, and a quiet stillness rested over everything. Elias wrapped himself in his thick wool coat, pulled on his worn leather gloves, and stepped outside with a small bucket of birdseed. The air was crisp enough to make every breath visible. As always, the chickadees gathered first. They fluttered from branch to branch, singing soft melodies that echoed through the silent pines. The familiar red fox appeared a few moments later, watching from across the frozen creek, before quietly disappearing into the trees. It seemed like an ordinary winter morning, but something felt different. As Elias walked toward the old mailbox beside the narrow path, he noticed a faint trail of footprints in the fresh snow. They were small, almost hidden beneath the night's snowfall, yet they were unmistakably human. His heart beat a little faster. No visitors had come this deep into the forest for years. He slowly opened the mailbox. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope. It carried no return address. Only his name was written across the front in careful handwriting. Elias Mercer. For several long moments he simply stared at it. The paper felt cold in his hands, yet somehow comforting, as though it had traveled a great distance carrying more than words. Back inside the cabin, he placed another log onto the fire and sat in his favorite rocking chair near the window. The flames danced softly across the wooden walls, while snow continued falling beyond the glass. With gentle hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was only one page. The letter read, "If you are reading this, then kindness has survived another winter. Years ago, you helped a frightened traveler find warmth during the coldest night of his life. You may not remember me, but I never forgot you. Your simple fire, your hot soup, and your quiet words gave me hope when I had almost none left. Some gifts cannot be repaid. They can only be passed forward." There was no signature, only those few lines. Elias leaned back, his eyes fixed on the flickering fire. At first, he searched his memory without success. Over the years, many strangers had crossed his path. Some needed directions, some needed food, some simply needed someone willing to listen. Perhaps that was enough. Outside, the wind carried fresh snow across the frozen creek, slowly covering the mysterious footprints until they completely disappeared. It was as if the visitor had never been there. That evening, Elias placed the letter inside his old journal. For the first time in many winters, the cabin no longer felt quite as lonely. Someone somewhere still remembered him. As darkness settled over the forest, he stood beneath the countless stars and whispered a quiet thank you into the cold night air. Far away, hidden beyond the endless trees, another traveler was making their way toward the little cabin, carrying a secret that would connect Elias to a forgotten chapter of his own life, one he believed had vanished forever beneath the snow. Part 3, The Stranger at Twilight. 3 days passed after the mysterious letter arrived. The forest returned to its familiar rhythm. Snow continued to fall in soft waves, covering old footprints and smoothing every path until the world looked untouched once more. Elias spent his mornings splitting firewood, brewing tea, and feeding the birds that trusted him enough to perch upon the porch railing. Yet his thoughts often drifted back to the letter. Who had written it? Why now? Each evening he found himself gazing through the frosted window a little longer than usual, wondering if another surprise might emerge from the endless white forest. On the fourth afternoon, thick gray clouds gathered above the pine trees. Snow began falling more heavily than before, and the wind carried long, gentle sighs through the branches. As twilight approached, Elias heard something unusual. A slow knock, 3 quiet taps on the cabin door. He opened it carefully. Standing outside was a young woman wrapped in a snow-covered blue coat. Frost clung to her scarf, and her cheeks were bright red from the cold. Beside her rested an old canvas backpack dusted with snow. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said softly. "The storm became stronger than I expected. May I warm myself for a little while?" Elias smiled kindly. "Of course. No one should face a winter storm alone." She stepped inside, gratefully holding her hands near the fire. The warmth slowly returned to her face as Elias poured 2 cups of hot cedar tea. "My name is Hannah," she said. "Elias." For a while they simply listened to the crackling fire. Silence inside the cabin never felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, as though the walls themselves understood that not every moment needed words. Hannah's eyes wandered across the shelves filled with handmade wooden carvings. Tiny birds, deer, foxes, and bears stood carefully arranged beside stacks of worn books. "You made these?" she asked. Elias nodded. "They keep my hands busy during the long winters." "They're beautiful." He thanked her with a quiet smile. After a few moments, Hannah carefully removed something from her backpack. It was an old wooden bird. Its wings were carved with remarkable detail, though time had softened its edges. Elias stared at it. His expression changed instantly. "I remember this," he whispered. "Years ago, I carved it for a frightened little boy who had become separated from his family during a snowstorm." Hannah smiled gently. "That little boy was my father." The room became perfectly still. She continued quietly. "He often told me about the lonely carpenter in the forest who welcomed a stranger without asking for anything in return. He kept this bird for his entire life." Elias felt warmth rise behind his eyes. "So, the letter—" "My father wrote it before he passed away last spring," Hannah said softly. "He asked me to deliver it when I was ready." Outside, snow continued drifting silently through the pine trees. Inside the little cabin, 2 lives, separated by decades, had finally found each other again. Neither of them realized that the greatest gift was still waiting to be discovered, hidden beneath the floorboards of the old cabin, where a forgotten wooden box had rested undisturbed for more than 30 years. Part 4, The Box Beneath the Floor. That night, the snowstorm wrapped the little cabin in a peaceful silence. The wind no longer howled. Instead, it whispered through the tall pines like an old lullaby. Inside, the fire glowed warmly as Elias and Hannah shared a simple dinner of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and hot herbal tea. For the first time in many years, laughter quietly filled the cabin. Hannah told stories about her father. He had become a teacher in a small town, always reminding his students that one act of kindness could travel farther than anyone imagined. Whenever life became difficult, he would place the small wooden bird on his desk and remember the stranger who had once welcomed him during a freezing winter night. My father believed, Hannah said softly, that kindness never disappears. It simply finds another heart. Elias lowered his eyes. He had never imagined that one cold evening so many years ago would shape another person's entire life. As the fire settled into glowing embers, Hannah noticed a loose wooden board near the fireplace. "It looks different from the others," she whispered. Elias knelt beside it. "I've lived here for 7 winters," he said with a gentle smile. "I never noticed." Together they carefully lifted the old board. Beneath it rested a small cedar box, covered in dust and wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. The wood had darkened with age, but the box remained perfectly preserved. Elias opened it slowly. Inside lay several yellowed letters, an old silver pocket watch, and a folded photograph. His hands trembled. The photograph showed a young Elias standing beside Clara outside the very same cabin. Both of them were smiling, surrounded by deep snow. On the back, written in Clara's graceful handwriting, were the words, "No matter how long winter lasts, love always remembers the way home." Elias closed his eyes. For years, he believed every reminder of Clara had been lost when they left their first home. Yet here, beneath the floor of the cabin they once dreamed of owning together, a piece of her had been waiting in silence. One letter remained unopened. The envelope carried Clara's handwriting. It simply read, "For Elias, when your heart is ready." The room became perfectly still. He gently unfolded the letter. Clara wrote that if he ever found it, she hoped he would choose hope over loneliness. She wished for him to keep building, keep creating, and never close his heart because love could return in unexpected ways. A single tear rolled down Elias's cheek. Not from sorrow, but from gratitude. Outside, snowflakes drifted softly beneath the moonlight, covering the forest in quiet silver. Inside the cabin, the weight Elias had carried for so many winters finally began to lift, and although neither of them knew it yet, the coming sunrise would bring an unexpected visitor whose arrival would give the little cabin a future far brighter than either of them had ever dreamed. Part 5. A home filled with light. The morning arrived quietly, wrapped in silver mist and fresh snow. Sunlight filtered through the tall pine trees, turning every snowflake into a tiny crystal. For the first time in many winters, Elias stepped outside carrying not only his cup of tea, but also a peaceful heart. Clara's letter rested safely inside his journal. Its words stayed with him. "Never close your heart because love always finds its way home." As he scattered birdseed across the porch, he noticed movement near the forest trail. A small boy, no older than 9, stood beside a sled buried in the snow. His wool hat had slipped over one eye, and he looked both nervous and exhausted. Hannah hurried toward him. "Are you all right?" The boy nodded shyly. "My name is Noah. My grandfather and I were traveling to the next village when our sled broke. He stayed behind to fix it and asked me to find help." Without hesitation, Elias grabbed his heavy coat, a lantern, and a thick blanket. The 3 of them followed the narrow trail until they found an elderly man sitting beside the broken sled. One of its wooden runners had snapped, making it impossible to continue. Elias smiled. "Let's see what we can do." Within an hour, using spare wood from a nearby fallen pine and the tools he always carried, he carefully repaired the sled. His hands still remembered every movement of a lifetime, spent building things that lasted. The old man shook his hand with grateful eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." Elias simply smiled. "You already have. Safe journeys are thanks enough." Before leaving, little Noah reached into his coat pocket. "I made this for you." It was a tiny pine cone tied with a red ribbon. "It's not much," Noah whispered. "But my grandmother says gifts made with love are never small." Elias carefully placed the little ornament into his pocket as though it were made of gold. Back at the cabin that evening, Hannah hung the pine cone near the window. "It belongs here," she said. The cabin looked different now. Not because the walls had changed, but because they no longer held only memories. They held new beginnings. As darkness settled outside, Elias lit an extra lantern and placed it in the front window. For travelers? Hannah asked. For anyone who might need to find their way, Elias replied. The soft golden light shone across the snowy forest, glowing gently beneath the stars. Far beyond the trees, someone noticed that light and quietly smiled. Without realizing it, Elias had become something far greater than a man living alone in the woods. He had become a beacon of hope. And before another winter came to an end, one final visitor would arrive with news that would forever transform the little cabin beneath the silent pines into a place where lonely hearts could always find their way home. Part 6. The Cabin That Never Slept Alone Again. Winter slowly began to loosen its gentle grip on the forest. The snow still covered the ground, but sunlight lingered a little longer each afternoon. Tiny drops of melting ice slipped from the cabin roof, creating a quiet rhythm that blended with the songs of returning birds. The lantern still glowed in the front window every evening. It had become a promise. One peaceful afternoon, a horse-drawn wagon appeared along the forest trail. Inside were 3 volunteers from a nearby mountain town. They had heard stories about the lonely cabin where strangers always found warmth, food, and kindness during winter storms. One of them smiled at Elias. "We've been looking for you." They explained that travelers, hikers, and families had shared stories about the little cabin for years. No one remembered every detail, but they all remembered the same feeling. They had arrived as strangers and left with hope. The town wanted to help preserve the cabin, not as a museum, but as a welcoming shelter for anyone who needed rest during the long northern winters. Elias looked around the room. The rocking chair, the stone fireplace, the wooden bird, Clara's photograph. For so many years he believed this place had been the end of his story. Instead, it had quietly become the beginning of someone else's. With Hannah's help, they repaired the roof, strengthened the walls, and built a small bookshelf filled with donated novels and journals. Elias carved a simple wooden sign and placed it beside the trail. The Silent Pines Cabin. May every traveler leave warmer than they arrived. As the seasons changed, visitors came from many places. Some stayed only an hour, some stayed a night, some arrived carrying heavy hearts and left carrying lighter ones. Each guest was invited to write a single page in the cabin journal. Years later, its pages were filled with messages of gratitude, hope, forgiveness, and quiet dreams. On one snowy evening, Elias sat beside the fire while Hannah read aloud from the journal. A young child had written, "I thought this was just a cabin. It turned out to be a place where people remember how to be kind." Elias smiled through gentle tears. He finally understood Clara's last words. Love had remembered the way home. When spring arrived, the forest awakened with fresh green branches and singing birds. Yet every winter the lantern returned to the front window, glowing softly through the falling snow. Long after Elias was gone, travelers continued to follow that light. Some never learned his name. They simply spoke of an old wooden cabin hidden beneath silent pines, a place where no one was judged. Every stranger was welcomed, and every lonely soul found peace before continuing the journey. And on quiet winter nights, when snow drifted gently through the forest and the fire crackled inside those familiar walls, it almost felt as though Elias and Clara were still there, smiling together, keeping the lantern lit for whoever needed it next. Because true kindness never disappears. Like a small light shining through the snow, it simply travels from one heart to another forever. The end.